and welcome to week 7. In week 7, we're going to look at some other civil rights movements that come out of the movement for African American civil rights. Um, so, the first, the civil rights movement is thought of as influencing other calls for civil rights during this period. Many other groups started demanding their rights be recognized and using the tactics that made the civil rights movement so successful. I'm going to discuss a few of those. Keep in mind that there are other calls for civil rights. Second wave feminism starts during this period. There's a Hispanic movement for civil rights for Latinos. And alone, I'm not going to have the opportunity to discuss because unfortunately we only have so much time. Okay, so the first incident, and I actually have divided these up into different lectures because I felt like they were going to be too long combined, so there are again 4 lectures this week like last week, but I'll say that not all of them are going to be as long as last week. I know last week was lecture intense, um, but this week should not be quite as long. There's just as many because I felt like the topics didn't necessarily go together. So the Stonewall Riot, for those of you familiar, is often thought as one of the first major moments in the gay rights movement. Like the African American movement, though there is actually early participation even before World War II. And that kind of early participation is not always recognized. So some interesting highlights that I'm going to talk about is Alfred Kinsey. He published Sexual Behavior in the Human Male in 1948. You may or may not be familiar with Kinsey and his Kinsey reports, which became famous for their studies of sexuality. So what he said in his report was 37% of men have enjoyed homosexual activities at least once. And that was startling to most people. While it's not clearly a majority, it's far higher than people thought, since at the time homosexuality was still considered to be a mental illness. So that was a really important finding for the community to say. It's a much larger percentage and a much larger part of the population that is participating in these acts. The American Psychiatric Association lists homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance in its first publication of the Diagnostic Statistics Manual of Mental Disorders. Immediately following the manual's release, many professionals in medicine, mental health, and social sciences criticized the category due to the lack of empirical scientific data. And that's really important because that means that homosexuals were basically faced with the idea that there was a diagnosable code in the first DSM manual for them. During the Cold War, there was a marked increase in anti-homosexual actions. So in 1953, President Eisenhower put out Executive Order 10450. And what it did was it established that the FBI would be in charge of investigating people according to definitions and conditions described in there. Now, it doesn't mention the word homosexuality specifically, but it does talk about sexual perversions, which are pretty clearly defined as homosexuality. So that's often called the Lavender Scare in addition to the Red Scare. Bayard Rustin, who I talked about last week, was a part of the Lavender Scare. He was left-leaning, often a communist before, in his early political days, and he was a non-closeted homosexual. He didn't necessarily talk about it, but he was very open with his sexuality and who he was and was not. And he was not only shunned and difficult on the level of the government, but as I talked about some last week, during the civil rights movement, some people didn't want him to actively participate because they felt like it was a poor image. Um, so the Mattachine Society was founded in 1951 by Harry Hay, who was a gay rights activist since the 1940s. Its name is derived from the medieval Society of Masked Players, the Society Mattachine, to represent the public making of a masking of homosexuality. So this idea that homosexuals, when out in public, had to wear a mask. And there were lots of branches all over. One of the first lesbian rights organizations in the United States is the Daughters of Bilitis. That's founded in 1955. And then One Inc. versus Olson in 1958 supported the First Amendment rights of the homosexual magazine. Both the post office and others were trying to stop mail delivery, saying that they were not required to deliver obscene things. And basically, the court argued that this was not obscene by nature of it being homosexual. The first sip-in, we talked about that. There are sit-ins, and then they kind of disperse into a broader movement. Julius Baer in Greenwich Village in 1966, there was a sip-in, primarily the Mattachine Society, and they basically sat in and asked for service. So then let me talk a little bit about Stonewall. So the bar was originally founded in 1967. It was raided one night around 1 a.m. The police claimed to want to clean up the neighborhood. The legal charge is the New York Liquor Authority would not allow gay bars to have a liquor license. They claimed that homosexuals were naturally disorderly. It turns into a 3-day riot. There's minimal media coverage, but what it does is it unites the movement, and people really come around because Stonewall was the Stonewall Inn was an important part of their community. In 1970, Christopher Street Liberation Day commemorates the year anniversary and leads the first gay parade, and there are thousands that come out to march. So it kind of becomes a touchstone point for the movement, even if the media didn't at the time recognize how important it was. In 1973, the Board of American Psychiatric Association finally removes homosexuality as a mental illness. So in conclusion, Stonewall Riot is often considered the starting moment, but in reality, like other civil rights movements, there are movements and actions that take place before this kind of watershed moment. The Cold War caused a lot of hardships for homosexuals who were mistreated as a part of the Lavender Scare. They were treated like communists and spies merely for being gay. The theory was that that communists could, even if homosexuals were not communist leaning, that they could be blackmailed through their homosexuality. But the reality was the only way they could be blackmailed was if the workers cared that they were homosexual. So we could have accomplished just as much by being accepting. And this is probably one of the key moments that the movement starts and really unites and kind of moves forward. Okay guys, this is my reference slide for the Stonewall Riot. In case you're interested in doing some information, there's some great timelines and some other information about some of the societies and the actions I talked about. Thanks, have a great week.